Chicago Bears general manager Ryan Poles says he's open to trading down again from the 9th overall pick. But at some point, the Bears are going to start missing out on good players. So how far is too far to go?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On the show today, we look at what the possibilities might look like for the Chicago Bears at 9 if a trade becomes a possibility here. What type of scenario it would have to take for the Bears to move down from 9, both a scenario that would make sense for Ryan Poles as to a scenario he would want to trade down from number 9, but also what it would take logistically for another team to want to trade up to number 9. It's a two-way street here, and we can look at some of the draft possibilities that might make something like that a little bit more feasible. And we'll wrap up looking at, okay, what would the trade compensation look like depending on how far you go down, and at what point is that worth it for the Bears, and at what point is that no longer worth the squeeze and just stay at 9 and take the guys that are best available at that spot. The reason why this comes up is because on Friday, I believe it was, the Chicago Sun-Times posted an article where they interviewed Ryan Poles briefly at I think at the NFL owners meeting or something, and he had mentioned in a quote there that he's open to trading the 9th pick and to moving down again if things play out a certain way and if the board represents it that way, right? It's not like he's specifically seeking to trade down and desperate to trade down and calling around now to see what possible offers he could get to trade down, but just saying, yeah, we're not closing the door on trading down again, that depending on how the board goes, perhaps that could be what's in the best interest of the Bears and the best interest of their draft strategy as a whole. But you start to run into this question, right, of like, when is it worth it and when is it no longer worth it to keep trading down? Because I think fan bases for every team really always want their team to be able to trade down, get some extra draft capital, and then still be able to land a player that you really want at your lower pick. And maybe it's a player that you would have liked at your higher pick, but now you got him, the same player, at this lower pick, and then also added whatever draft picks and compensation you receive in order to move down, right? It's squeezing the most that you can out of that draft spot and still getting the player that you want to get. But at some point, the farther down you go, the more talent you're going to miss out on. And, the player that you're drafting later wasn't worth the earlier pick. And so you're not getting a player perhaps of the same caliber comparatively as to what you might consider, a top 10 talent, for example, with where the Bears are drafting this year, right? With the 9th overall pick, you have the opportunity to get a player. I mean, it's to quite literally get a top 10 pick, but really like to get that player that performs like a top 10 pick. And yes, top 10 quality players often get drafted outside of the top 10, but your best chances to get a good player are always going to be earlier in the draft. And the farther you go, the less chance you have of that player being very good. So the Bears need to sit there and ask themselves, okay, how many players do we really love in this draft? How many players do we feel really comfortable with? What players do we feel like we got to have? And where do we think we can still get those players? We've heard Ryan Poles say publicly that the team has about 7 total blue chip players in this draft that they feel like are really like can't miss type prospects. They're drafting 9th overall. Not a math major, but I'm pretty sure 7 is less than 9. So that would mean there's a chance, a strong chance, it's not a 100% chance, but more likely than not that most, if not all of those 7 blue chip players could be and may be gone by the time the Bears are on the clock with the 9th overall pick. And so I could see where, okay, if your 7th favorite player comes off at pick 8, so all 7 of your top guys are gone, then all of a sudden you're into your next tier, your next bracket, your next pool of players, right? They're not the blue chip category, you're into the next category. And if you're picking 9th and all of your blue chip players are gone, but maybe only one of your second tier players are gone, how much separation is there between all those guys in the next group? Do you feel like you have to be at 9 to get the best one of that group? Or do you feel like, yeah, I could trade down 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 spots and still get a similar player to the guy that I think I would get if I stayed at 9? I think guys will still be on the board, however farther down I can trade, and still be able to get somebody that I really like and still be able to get that draft capital and not feel like I'm missing out on players that I just can't afford to miss. The flip side of that is that if the Bears looked at the draft class and thought, yeah, all these players are about the same, let's trade down, you might think then that other teams could feel similarly and not want to trade up to say, oh, well, the blue chip players are gone, so what are we going to trade up to 9 for if we also kind of see these players in a similar range, right? It is a two-way street in that regard, and just because the Bears might be motivated based on the draft board to trade down doesn't mean that someone will be motivated to trade up. And if anything, the more motivated you are to trade down, it probably means the less motivated more teams are going to want to be to trade up, because teams would want to be trading up for something valuable. And if there's something valuable there, you are likely to also be interested in that valuable thing or valuable player, and therefore not want to be the one to trade down. The exception there, of course, is if it's a quarterback. And we've talked so much about quarterback needy teams and trading up because of the Bears and wanting to get, all these teams wanting to get up to the number 1 overall pick and the Bears moving down there. And we sort of presume, yes, quarterback is going to go number 1 for sure. Probably going to go number 2 as well. And the Colts at 4 look like a prime quarterback team. But this draft class kind of has a big 4 at quarterback. And maybe there's a chance one is still on the board when the Bears are on the clock with the 9th overall pick. And maybe that's a situation where a team may want to trade up. We'll look at the different dynamics that might lead a team that would want to trade up, while the Bears would also be willing to trade down and not as worried about missing out on a player because they don't want the quarterback anyway. Next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. So you can't lose on your first bet. It either wins and you get money, or it loses and you get bonus bets right back to you. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and sign up today to claim your no-sweat first bet. Then you can wager on everything from the money line to point spreads to which teams are going to go farther in March Madness in the NBA playoffs. You can bet on NFL draft props on which players will be drafted where to what teams, and so much more, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss your shot at a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL and NBA. It takes 2 to tango in an NFL draft trade, and that means having somebody that wants to come up as much as you want to go down. And I think there are a couple of scenarios where the Bears would be sitting there at 9, willing and interested to move down, and teams would be interested in moving up to 9, and that those two interests wouldn't conflict, right? It wouldn't be like the Bears would want to stay at 9 because there's such a good player there that they got to trade down, or that they don't want to trade down and just take the player, but it would be a good enough player or a type of player that other teams would want to trade up for. First of all, with the quarterbacks, right? We expect at this point the FanDuel betting favorite for the first quarterback taken and who the number 1 overall pick will be. The betting favorite is C.J. Stroud from Ohio State. There was a live mic at the Ohio State Pro Day where the Panthers quarterbacks coach, who is Josh McCown, by the way, was talking to C.J. Stroud and used a line, something along the lines of, hey, when you are in Charlotte with us, we'll have to play basketball sometime. Or when you get your house in Charlotte. Like, he was using the words when, like, hey, we are going to draft you, is essentially what the impetus there is based on the quote that he said. Of course, that's not actual confirmation that they're going to draft him, but it seems like things are trending in that direction. Houston at 2, expected to take a quarterback, will probably be Bryce Young. I still see them as a team that could be a wild card to take a defensive player like Will Anderson, but quarterback is the most valuable thing, but they have the pick at 12, which could be a later quarterback if they're not in love with this quarterback class in the same way. The Colts at 4, expected to take a quarterback. They were one of the teams that was interested in moving up to the number 1 overall pick with the Bears, were a little gun shy and didn't ultimately agree to the deal the way that the Panthers did. But once you get after those 4, or those 3 teams, but those first 4 picks, because the Cardinals are the number 3 pick, they're not taking a quarterback. There's a chance then that there's a little bit of a fall here for whatever quarterback is left untaken. And maybe the Colts, after C.J. Stroud and Bryce Young are off the board, maybe the Colts say, screw it. We're not taking Anthony Richardson or Will Levis at 4. It's not worth it to us. We're going to wait, and maybe no one wants to trade up at that point. But then there's a spot for the quarterbacks to start to fall, because you got the Seahawks at 5, who just signed Geno Smith to a contract extension. I suppose they could take a quarterback for the long-term future, but they seem more focused on winning now with Geno Smith. You got the Rams at 6, who I think should take a long-term quarterback behind Jared Goff, but they also seem a lot more focused on winning now and building around him as their quarterback for the immediate future. You got the Raiders at 7, who tried to trade up to number 1 with the Bears, did not, and ended up signing Jimmy Garoppolo to a 3-year deal. They could still take a quarterback. They are locked into Jimmy G for at least this season guaranteed, and probably 2 seasons mostly guaranteed. And then from there, they can get out of the Jimmy Garoppolo contract. So does that mean they want to take a quarterback at 7? Or do they want to use that draft pick to get more support for Jimmy Garoppolo and try and win now with the veteran quarterback that they just signed? I could kind of see that going either way. The Falcons at 8 were a team that was talked about as a potential dark horse team that could trade up to the Bears at 1, but I don't think that ever really got anywhere or had legs. They just drafted Desmond Ridder in the 3rd round last year, and then they signed Tyler Heineke in free agency, and they also have Logan Woodside. So they don't strike me as a team that is necessarily going to use the 8th overall pick on a quarterback. They could, right? Them and the Raiders are both like, yeah, it wouldn't stun you, but it doesn't seem 100% likely there unless they really fall in love with one of these quarterbacks. And so if all those teams pass on QBs, that brings us to number 9. The Chicago Bears on board. And if Anthony Richardson and or Will Levis is on the board at 9, does that become a spot where teams may look to trade up or may have interest in trading up? Because all of a sudden, it's a little bit of a heavier trade. You have to give up a lot more to trade up to 7 with the Raiders, or 6 to the Lions, 5 to the Seahawks, or 3 to the Arizona Cardinals if you want to get up past those teams to try and get a quarterback. But you start getting to 9, and the farther you go, the lower that price tag starts to be. Maybe you could make the same argument for the Eagles at 10 if the quarterbacks are still there, because the Bears aren't going to take one, so why bother trading up to 9 when you could trade up to 10? But 11 at Tennessee would seem like the team that everyone would want to get past. There have been murmurings that they're ready to move on from Ryan Tannehill or aren't in love with Ryan Tannehill long term, and maybe this is the year they draft a quarterback and let Ryan Tannehill be the bridge quarterback for one more year and then go to the rookie just after this year with Ryan Tannehill. So could a team like the Washington Commanders at 16 want to jump past the Titans at 11 and maybe see the Bears at 9 or maybe the Eagles at 10 as the team to get there? The Jets at 13, they're waiting on Aaron Rodgers right now. They still have Zach Wilson under contract. Probably not a quarterback drafting team, although you're not going to have Rodgers for very long, and they don't really seem to have faith in Zach Wilson anymore. But they're not going to trade for Rodgers and draft a quarterback. They may even end up trading that draft pick to the Green Bay Packers for Aaron Rodgers at 13. So that becomes a little bit less of a either an obstacle or a trade candidate either way. So that brings me back down to Washington at 16, needs a quarterback. Tampa Bay at 19 claims they love Kyle Trask, but we heard the Arizona Cardinals claim they love Josh Rosen and then turn around and draft a quarterback, right? I don't put too much stock in the Buccaneers saying, hey, we really love Kyle Trask and are going all in on him as their quarterback. And depending on what happens with Lamar Jackson and the Baltimore Ravens, do they become a quarterback team at 22? Or if some team gives Lamar Jackson a contract and he takes it, and the Ravens get 2 first-round picks from whatever team signs Lamar Jackson, do they become a team that now has a couple of higher draft picks, wherever that might be, whatever team would sign him? And then do they now become a team that could trade up to try and get one of these quarterbacks? They have Tyler Huntley, excuse me. That's an insult right there. They have Tyler Huntley. They seem to like him, but, would they be interested in drafting a quarterback that's, just to have something a little bit more in the books there in case Huntley doesn't quite pan out for them. So you can see some scenarios where a quarterback is there at 9 and a couple teams might be interested in coming up. We could also see Jalen Carter from Georgia, the defensive lineman who's had some legal trouble and some character questions, like some love of the game, football questions, on and off the field questions. We had a terrible pro day from Jalen Carter. If he starts falling to 9, is there a team that says he's falling? We have a shot to go get maybe the best defensive player in the draft, maybe the most talented defensive player in the draft. Let's go get him at 9 because we think the Eagles might take him at 10 because that's a very Philadelphia Eagles move to draft a really good defensive lineman like this and make it work because they're a veteran team that can afford a risk like this. Could a team want to move up to jump them to get Jalen Carter at 9? I mean, the Bears might be then interested in Jalen Carter at 9, but I don't think he really fits exactly where Ryan Poles is in terms of evaluation and where the team is. And I want to talk more about that coming up soon on a future Locked On Bears podcast. But it just feels like between the quarterbacks and maybe Jalen Carter or maybe one of the cornerbacks or something, there could be players on the board at 9 that other teams want that maybe the Bears don't or aren't married to and would be willing to move down and give up the possibility to get them, knowing that they could get some nice draft compensation in return. Just how much draft compensation? Well, we'll look at some of the historical trends for trades around this range to get a sense of what kind of picks the Bears could pick up if they move down next on Locked On Bears. Trying to accurately predict, gauge, measure draft trade compensation is always an inexact science. I want to make that caveat clear on the front end that even as much as we might look at, the draft trade charts that people have put together where you assign a numerical value to each draft pick, and then you can kind of look and say, okay, the 9th pick is worth 3,000 points, and the 15th pick is worth 2,700 points. So then you could add 300 points worth of picks, which would be the 4th round pick. There are those charts, and those are based on some historical numbers and some averaging based on pick value. But those are not strictly followed by NFL teams, if that's not clear. Like those are just kind of guesstimates. Teams will look at that as some of a guidepost to give them a general range of what might be fair. But I think teams also more concretely look at, okay, what have other teams drafting here or the picks right around here, what have they gotten for their picks to move up or to move down? What have other teams spent? What is the actual market saying as opposed to this chart? Because sometimes teams get desperate and give up more than other teams have to move a similar amount of space. Like if you comb back through, we really need a better database of every NFL draft trade. I would love to see a better. There's a couple of them and they're okay, but they're not super well organized or user friendly. But I go through and kind of dig through like the NFL.com trade tracker for 2022 draft and look at those, and then their trade tracker for the 2021 draft. It's a pain in the butt to have to go through each individual draft and find the trades from each draft and then kind of stack them up and compare them. We need a better NFL draft trade database. But regardless, you can look through and see when a team goes from one pick to another and gives up a certain amount, and then in a different draft, it's the same picks. You go from the same spot to the same spot, but the compensation is way different because, again, sometimes a team gets desperate for a quarterback and gives up a future first-round pick when they shouldn't, or sometimes they really love a certain player and give up a bunch, and sometimes it's a team that's kind of desperate to move down, and so they're willing to take less in that move down just because they know they can get something, and I'd rather trade down a few spots and get a kind of a crappy pick just to get something when I really don't want to stay at this pick because I know I don't need to be at that spot. So there's never a set defined market value for how much draft capital you should expect to get back to move down from one pick to another. It's always fluctuating a little bit based on a lot of very individual case-by-case circumstances. But a few of them stood out to me as being kind of around the Bears range. I wasn't looking I didn't want to narrow it to just 9th overall picks. What are people getting for the 9th overall pick? That one specifically hasn't been traded a ton lately. I mean, you can go back farther historically, but over the last 3 or 4 drafts, we have seen the 10th and 11th picks traded a few different times, and we can kind of get a sense of okay, if you go down a couple spots, how much do you get? If you go down a handful of spots, how much do you get? And if you go down a lot of spots, how much do you get? Like, for example, just a year or two ago, a team went from the 10th pick to the 12th pick, just 2 spots down. Whoever was at 12, and I don't have the teams in front of me, they wanted to jump up past whoever was at 11 to get to 10. And they gave up a 3rd round pick to move 2 spots, but 2 spots into the top 10, but still a 3rd round pick to go from 10 to 12. Like if the Bears could get a 3rd round pick to go from 9 to 12 with Houston or 9 to 11 with Tennessee or whatever, like I think that would be great value. I think that would be an ideal type of scenario for the Bears. Based on some of the other trades, I don't know if that seems like maybe a little bit rich. I don't know if that's what we should expect every time. That feels to me like a little bit more of a desperation value there, because a couple of years ago, a team went from 11 to 16, so down 5 spots, not into the top 10, just outside of the top 10, but 5 spots, and got a 3rd and a 4th. So like that's only a 4th round pick more than what the team gave up to go from 12 to 10. So, and it was a late 3rd round pick for that one. It was a compensatory 3rd round pick, 98th overall. But still, a 3rd and a 4th round pick to go down 5 spots feels like a lot less compared to a 3rd round pick to go down 2 spots. So like, you can kind of see where, depending on the year, depending on the desperation, depending on the teams, you're not always getting the same kind of value from pick to pick. We saw, you may remember, the Bears traded from the 20th overall pick to the 11th overall pick to take Justin Fields. That was moving up 9 spots, not to 9, but to 11, fairly close, but not quite as close. It'd take a little more to get up to 9. And the Bears, you may remember, for Fields, they gave up their future 1st round pick, which was last year's 1st round pick, plus a 4th round pick and a 5th round pick. That's quite a bit to move up 9 spots, but, to get a quarterback, sometimes you have to make that type of a move. And certainly I think for the Bears, it's working out. And the better Justin Fields is, the more you'll look back and say, oh, that doesn't matter what you gave up. The quarterback worked. That's all that matters. But a couple of years before that, or was it last year, another recent year here, a team went from 20 to 10. So the Bears went from 20 to 11, gave up a future 1st, a 4th, and a 5th. Another year, a team went from 20 to 10, so 1 spot higher, and they gave up a 2nd and a 3rd. So, they moved up 10 spots and gave up a 2nd and a 3rd to go with it. So you can kind of get that sense of like, okay, if the Bears are going to go from 9 down, say, 10 spots would be Tampa Bay. Say the Buccaneers wanted to trade up to a quarterback. You could be looking at a future 1st round pick. You could be looking at a 2nd and a 3rd round pick this year instead. We can make arguments as to what's more valuable. It depends on the team. It depends on which 2nd and 3rd round picks you're getting and in what years. Because would you take an extra 2nd round pick this year as opposed to a 1st round pick next year? I'd still maybe lean 1st round pick next year in those cases, but some different possibilities depending on how desperate Tampa Bay would be in this hypothetical, or how many other teams would be trying to bid against them to get up to the 9th overall pick. Some different options there. Or if the Bears traded from 9 down to 11, 12, 13, 14, in that like 2 or 3 pick range, maybe that's a 3rd round pick. Maybe you start to get to like 5 picks down. If you start to get, more like Washington at 16, it becomes a 3rd and a 4th round pick, or, a 3rd and a future 3rd. Like, these are the types of draft compensation extra that we could see the Bears get if they were to trade down from the 9th overall pick, which sounds great. As long as you feel like, okay, if I'm trading down to 16, can I still get a top offensive tackle for Justin Fields? Paris Johnson probably won't still be there. Peter Skoronski probably won't still be there. But are you happy with Broderick Jones instead? Darnell Wright from Tennessee? Like, that's the kind of drop-off you'd be looking at. Or at the edge rushers, right? Like, at number 9, probably not a guy like Tyree Wilson, but, is Lucas Van Ness there in that range? Does he come off the board by the time you get to 16? Or, interior defensive tackles like Kalijah Kancey or Brian Brisset from Clemson? Like, do you end up dropping down more into that range instead of some of the higher end pass rushers? And the cornerbacks too, Witherspoon from Illinois and Gonzalez from, I forget what school he went to. Like, the 2 top cornerbacks, one or both of them might be there at 9, but they probably won't be there at 16. So how far down are you willing to go? Could you still land them if you went from 9 to 12? Maybe you can still get one of the tackles or one of the edge rushers or one of the cornerbacks at 12. But can you get them at 16, right? Ryan Poles is going to look at his draft board and figure out, where's the dead zone? Where's the absolute farthest down I can go where I still feel like I'm going to get one of these guys that I really like, and I'm not dropping into another tier lower and missing out on this rare opportunity to add a can't-miss blue-chip top 10 caliber player in the draft. The farther you go, the less likely that is. But man, those future or current 3rd, 4th, 2nd, 1st round picks that you could get for trading down, it's hard not to fall in love with those as a real possibility either. Whatever the Bears end up doing in the NFL draft, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, check out our new Locked On NFL Scouting show here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We're your team every day. And with Locked On NFL Scouting, it's Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs breaking down the whole league, league-wide perspective, but looking at the team-building aspects of free agent signings, trades, draft picks, etc. Really kind of understanding like salary cap and how teams go about this process. They have great chemistry. It's a lot of fun. They know a lot about the game. So go check out Locked On NFL Scouting for your second listen. Coming back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears. And of course, you have to come back for your next opportunity to bear down.